August 13th, 1944. 23,000 feet above the rail junction at Hasselt, Belgium. Second Lieutenant Neal Worley pushed the stick forward on his P-47D Thunderbolt, rolling inverted to keep the target in sight as 8 tons of American engineering pointed its nose toward the earth. Through the oil-streaked windscreen, he could see the locomotive pulling what German intelligence estimated was an entire battalion's worth of artillery and ammunition toward the collapsing front in Normandy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics were simple and brutal. One 500-pound bomb, properly placed, would destroy that locomotive. The artillery would never reach the front. The ammunition would detonate in a fireball visible for miles. German soldiers would die because supplies never arrived. American soldiers would live because those same supplies were consumed in flame before they could be used. But between Worley and that locomotive lay something the Luftwaffe had spent 25% of Germany's entire war production to create. A wall of steel so dense that flying through it seemed like flying through a rainstorm made of metal. 3.7 centimeter Flak 43 automatic cannons cycling at 120 rounds per minute. 2 centimeter Flak quad-mount guns pouring out 1,800 rounds per minute. 88mm guns throwing shells that could tear a wing off at 3 miles distance. The German flak crews had been training for this exact moment since the Allies landed in Normandy 10 weeks earlier. They knew American fighter bombers would come. They knew the tactics. They knew the altitude, the speed, the angle of attack. They had computed the lead angles, practiced the tracking, positioned their guns for overlapping fields of fire. What the German gunners did not know, what they could not have predicted, was that American pilots had discovered something profound about the physics of diving attacks. They had learned that the fastest path through hell was straight down at 500 miles per hour, and they had learned that a 7-ton fighter built like a flying fortress could survive passage through that hell when lighter, more elegant aircraft would disintegrate. Worley's attack would become one of thousands that transformed the P-47 Thunderbolt from high-altitude escort fighter into the most effective ground attack aircraft of the European campaign. But the transformation came at extraordinary cost. Between June and August 1944, the 9th Air Force lost nearly 23% of its fighter-bomber pilots. They were not lost to enemy fighters, which the Luftwaffe could no longer field in meaningful numbers. They were lost to German anti-aircraft fire during low-altitude attacks on the transportation network that sustained German armies. The story of how American pilots learned to dive through concentrated flak to destroy locomotives, and why they achieved kill ratios approaching 86 locomotives destroyed per week at the campaign's peak, reveals a tactical evolution driven by desperate necessity. It demonstrates how the P-47's unique combination of structural strength, firepower, and survivability enabled attacks that would have been suicidal in any other aircraft. And it shows how American industrial capacity, translated into overwhelming numbers of replaceable aircraft and trained pilots, ultimately defeated German tactical ingenuity and defensive preparation. The campaign to destroy Germany's rail network began not with grand strategy, but with accident and improvisation. Throughout early 1943, the 8th Air Force's P-47 groups flew bomber escort missions deep into German territory. Their primary role was protecting Boeing B-17 flying fortresses and consolidated B-24, liberators from Luftwaffe interceptors. Ground attack was considered a secondary mission, something pilots might attempt opportunistically after escort duties were complete. The first recorded P-47 strafing attack on a locomotive occurred entirely by chance in March 1943. A pilot from the 56th Fighter Group, damaged by German fighters over France, found himself at low altitude, fuel streaming from punctured tanks, trying desperately to reach England before his engine quit. As he skimmed across the French countryside at 200 feet, a German locomotive appeared directly ahead, pulling a freight train toward the coast. The pilot, whose name was never recorded in official documents, made a split-second decision. He squeezed the trigger. 8 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, converged their fire on the locomotive's boiler. At 300 yards range, firing a 2-second burst, he delivered approximately 160 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition into the locomotive. The boiler exploded. Superheated steam at 300 pounds per square inch vented violently. The locomotive derailed, pulling 17 freight cars with it. The pilot climbed away, made it back to England on fumes, and filed a combat report that would change how the Army Air Forces thought about tactical air power. The report reached Major General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command, in April 1943. Kepner, who understood that destroying Germany's transportation infrastructure was as important as destroying its aircraft factories, immediately ordered tactical experimentation. If one damaged P-47 could destroy a locomotive and 17 freight cars, what could a squadron of P-47 seconds accomplish if they deliberately hunted locomotives? The answer came in May 1944, during an operation that would be remembered with dark humour as Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo. On May 21, 1944, 763 Allied Expeditionary Air Force fighters swept over northern France while 500 8th Air Force fighters ranged across Germany, systematically hunting locomotives and rail infrastructure. The mission name came from the popular Glenn Miller song that had topped American charts 3 years earlier. But there was nothing amusing about the execution. The first P-47 groups crossed the French coast at 25,000 feet, high enough to avoid most anti-aircraft fire, positioned to see hundreds of miles in every direction. Pilots scanned rail lines, looking for the telltale smoke from coal-burning locomotives. When they spotted a train, the attack sequence began. The flight leader would roll inverted, a maneuver that allowed him to keep the target in sight while pointing his nose downward. Then he would pull 4 to 5 Gs, bringing the aircraft into a dive angle between 45 and 60 degrees, steep enough that the target remained centered in his gun sight throughout the descent. The P-47 would accelerate rapidly. At 15,000 feet, indicated airspeed would reach 300 miles per hour. At 10,000 feet, 400. At 8,000 feet, approaching 475. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 18 cylinders producing 2,000 horsepower, was screaming at maximum RPM. The 4-blade Curtiss electric propeller, 13 feet in diameter, was absorbing so much power that its tips approached supersonic velocity, creating a distinctive howling sound that German soldiers learned to fear. The pilot would center the target in his reflector gun sight, a device that projected aiming marks onto a transparent glass plate mounted at eye level. At 6,000 feet altitude, traveling at over 450 miles per hour in a 60-degree dive, he would press the firing button on his control stick. All 8 50 caliber machine guns would fire simultaneously. Each gun cycled at approximately 800 rounds per minute, creating a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute. In a 3-second burst, the pilot would fire approximately 300 rounds, each weighing 1.7 ounces, each traveling at 2,800 feet per second. At convergence range, typically set for 300 yards, all 8 guns' fire would concentrate on a point roughly the size of a barrel. The kinetic energy delivered in 3 seconds exceeded 2 million foot-pounds. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds would penetrate locomotive boilers, detonate in fuel bunkers, rupture steam lines, destroy control systems. But the attack was only beginning. At 4,000 feet altitude, the pilot would release his bombs. Early P-47D models carried a single 500-pound bomb beneath the fuselage centerline. Mid-production P-47D variants carried 2 500-pound bombs on wing pylons. Late production P-47D and later models could carry 2,000-pound bombs, though this configuration reduced range significantly and was rarely used for locomotive attacks. The bombs would fall free, following a ballistic trajectory determined by the aircraft's forward velocity and dive angle. From a 60-degree dive at 450 miles per hour, releasing at 4,000 feet altitude, the bombs would impact approximately 700 feet ahead of where they were released, hitting the target 3 seconds after release. Then came the most dangerous moment of the entire attack sequence, the pullout. At 4,000 feet, traveling at 470 miles per hour in a 60-degree dive, the pilot would pull back firmly on the control stick. The P-47 would begin its recovery arc, generating G-forces that pressed the pilot deep into his seat. 4 Gs, 5, 6. At 6 Gs, blood drained from the pilot's brain toward his lower body. Vision narrowed to a tunnel. Some pilots blacked out, momentarily. To counter this, P-47 pilots had developed anti-G straining techniques. They would tense their leg muscles and abdominal muscles vigorously, raising blood pressure and forcing blood back toward the brain. They would grunt or shout loudly, increasing pressure in the chest cavity. They learned to pull exactly 6 Gs when possible, accepting a slightly shallower recovery angle to reduce blackout risk. The recovery arc would bring the P-47 back to level flight at approximately 1,500 feet altitude. The entire attack sequence, from initial rollover at 20,000 feet to recovery at 1,500 feet, consumed less than 60 seconds and covered approximately 3 miles of horizontal distance. But in that 60 seconds, the pilot had flown through what German flak gunners called the Flakkasten, the flak box, a precisely calculated 3-dimensional zone of overlapping anti-aircraft fire designed to destroy any aircraft that entered it. The German flak arm was the most sophisticated anti-aircraft defense system ever created. By mid-1944, Germany was producing more anti-aircraft guns than tanks. Factory output included 3.7 cm Flak 36 and Flak 43 automatic cannons, 2 cm Flak 38 quad-mount guns designated Flakvierling, 5 cm Flak 41 guns, and the feared 8.8 cm Flak 18, 36, 37, and 41 guns that could engage targets from ground level to 32,000 feet altitude. These weapons were not randomly distributed. German flak commanders positioned batteries using calculated fields of fire, lead computing gun sights that automatically calculated deflection angles, and carefully prepared firing positions that provided protection for gun crews while maximizing engagement angles. A typical rail junction in occupied France would be defended by at least one battery of light flak, usually 4 to 6, 2 cm Flakvierling quad mounts, capable of putting 7,200 rounds per minute into the air. Medium flak consisted of 3.7 cm guns, typically 4 to 8 weapons per sight, firing high explosive shells with timed fuses that would detonate at predetermined altitudes, filling the air with shrapnel. Heavy flak, the 88mm guns that bomber crews feared most, would be positioned to engage aircraft at higher altitudes, from 10,000 to 25,000 feet. But the 88s could also be depressed to engage low-altitude targets, and their shells, weighing 20 pounds and containing 2 pounds of high explosive, could destroy a fighter with a single direct hit. German gun crews were trained to extraordinary proficiency. Optical rangefinders measured target distance and altitude. Mechanical computers calculated lead angles based on target speed and direction. Gun layers adjusted elevation and traverse continuously, tracking the target's motion. On command, all guns in the battery would fire simultaneously, creating a saturation barrage that filled the target's flight path with exploding metal. The German defenders had another advantage. They knew exactly where the attacking aircraft would be at every moment of the attack sequence. A fighter diving from 20,000 feet at 60 degrees would be at 15,000 feet after 12 seconds, 10,000 feet after 18 seconds, 5,000 feet after 24 seconds. The dive angle, speed, and recovery altitude were constrained by physics and by the requirement to hit the target accurately. This predictability meant German gunners could position their weapons to create overlapping fields of fire at the exact altitudes where American pilots were most vulnerable. The light flak would engage from 5,000 feet down to 1,000 feet. Medium flak would fill the zone from 8,000 down to 3,000. Heavy flak would target aircraft during the initial dive from 20,000 to 10,000. An attacking P-47 pilot would fly through all 3 zones. He would be under continuous fire for 30 to 40 seconds. The aircraft would be struck repeatedly. The question was not whether the P-47 would be hit, but whether it would be hit in a location that destroyed critical systems or killed the pilot. This was where the P-47's design philosophy proved decisive. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born engineer who designed the Thunderbolt at Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, had built the aircraft around a single principle: protection above performance, survivability above elegance. Every design choice reflected this priority. The pilot sat in what ground crews called an armoured bathtub, though the term understated its effectiveness. Behind the seat, 1/3-inch face-hardened steel armour could stop 20mm cannon rounds at close range. The headrest contained additional armour. Beneath the seat, more armour protected from ground fire. In front, 3/8-inch bulletproof glass could stop 30mm shells. Between the pilot and the engine sat the turbo supercharger system, oil coolers, and intercoolers. These massive components acted as additional armour, absorbing hits that would otherwise reach the cockpit. The fuselage structure used thick aluminum with redundant load paths. If primary structures were damaged, backup structures could carry the load. The fuel system was revolutionary. Every gallon of fuel was stored in self-sealing tanks, surrounded by multiple layers of rubber compound that would swell when exposed to gasoline, closing bullet holes within seconds. German pilots discovered that attacks which would send any other fighter down in flames simply punched holes in P-47 fuel tanks that sealed themselves. The P-47 kept flying. Most critically, the R2800 radial engine's configuration provided extraordinary battle damage tolerance. Unlike inline engines where a single cooling system hit caused rapid failure, the radial could lose entire cylinders and continue running. Pilots reported flying home on engines missing 3, 4, even 5 cylinders, still producing enough power to maintain altitude. This survivability fundamentally changed the tactical calculus of ground attack missions. In lighter aircraft, like the North American P-51 Mustang or Lockheed P-38 Lightning, diving through concentrated flak was nearly suicidal. Pilots would be forced to attack from shallow angles or standoff distances, reducing accuracy significantly. Mission effectiveness suffered because pilots prioritized survival over target destruction. In the P-47, pilots could press attacks aggressively. They could dive steeper, fire longer, release bombs at lower altitudes, all because they knew the aircraft could absorb damage and bring them home. This aggressive tactics translated directly into higher kill ratios and greater mission success. The transformation from high-altitude escort to low-altitude attacker accelerated dramatically after the Normandy invasion. On June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France, established beachheads along a 50-mile front in Normandy. Over 156,000 Allied troops landed by sea and air, but holding the beachhead and breaking out required preventing German reinforcements from reaching the front. The transportation network, particularly railroads, became the critical target. The German army in France depended absolutely on rail transport. Roads could move some supplies, but the tonnages required to sustain modern mechanized warfare exceeded what truck transport could provide. Divisions in Normandy consumed 500 tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment daily. Panzer divisions required even more. All of it came by rail. If the Allies could cut the railroads, German divisions would starve. Tanks would sit immobilized for lack of fuel. Artillery would fall silent for lack of shells. Infantry would run short of food and medical supplies. The entire German defensive position would collapse not through direct combat, but through logistical strangulation. This mission fell primarily to the 9th Air Force, the tactical air force supporting ground operations in France. By mid-June 1944, the 9th Air Force operated 13 P-47 fighter bomber groups, more than 300 aircraft, from rough airstrips carved out of French farm fields within artillery range of the front lines. The mission tempo was relentless. Pilots flew 3, sometimes 4 combat sorties daily. They would take off at dawn, fly armed reconnaissance missions, hunting locomotives and rail traffic, land to rearm and refuel, take off again, repeat until darkness grounded operations. The physical and psychological strain was immense. Second Lieutenant Milt Sanders, flying with the 514th Fighter Squadron, 406th Fighter Group from Asch, Belgium, described the routine in post-war interviews. We'd brief before dawn. Target would be a marshalling yard or rail junction. We'd take off with 2 500-pound bombs and full ammunition. Climb to 15,000, transit to the target area. Start looking for trains. When you found one, you'd call it in, set up the attack, roll inverted, dive, fire, bomb, pull out through the flak, climb back to altitude, find another train, do it again. We'd do this 6-7 times per mission. Land with the wing tips shot full of holes, patch the aircraft overnight, do it again tomorrow. The cumulative effect was devastating for German logistics. In the first week after D-Day, P-47 seconds destroyed or damaged 123 locomotives. In the second week, 147. By the end of June, the total exceeded 400. German commanders reported that rail operations in daylight had become impossible. Trains could move only at night, and even then, P-47 groups, equipped with external lights and flares, were beginning night interdiction operations. The psychological impact on German locomotive crews was profound. French trainmen, forced to operate trains under German occupation, began deserting in large numbers after mid-June. They would abandon locomotives and hide when P-47 seconds appeared. German authorities were forced to bring in German trainmen, but even they requested reassignment after experiencing attacks. Operating a locomotive in France after D-Day had become one of the most dangerous assignments in the German military, with casualty rates exceeding frontline infantry. But the campaign was equally costly for American pilots. The German Flak arm adapted quickly to American tactics. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By early July 1944, German Flak commanders had identified patterns in P-47 attacks and developed countermeasures that dramatically increased American casualties. The most effective German innovation was mounting anti-aircraft guns directly on railroad trains themselves, creating mobile flak batteries that accompanied every high-value transport. The concept was brutally simple. If American fighters were hunting locomotives, the locomotives would hunt back. German engineers mounted 2-centimeter Flak A, 38 quad guns, and 3.7-centimeter Flak A, 43 cannons on reinforced flat cars, positioned immediately behind the locomotive and at intervals throughout the train. Gun crews rode in armored cars, ready to engage attacking aircraft from any direction. These mobile flak batteries transformed locomotive attacks from dangerous missions into near-suicide runs. A pilot diving on what appeared to be an ordinary freight train would suddenly find himself flying into concentrated automatic cannon fire from multiple directions. The guns were specifically positioned to engage aircraft during the critical pull-out phase, when pilots were most vulnerable, experiencing high G-forces and unable to maneuver effectively. Colonel Leo Moon, commanding officer of the 404th Fighter Group, discovered this new German tactic on March 12, 1945, during an attack on 2 trains near the Ardennes front. Moon's combat report, preserved in National Archives records, describes the encounter with clinical precision. I spotted 2 locomotives pulling what appeared to be supply trains toward the front lines. Weather was overcast at 8,000 feet, providing some concealment for our approach. I led my flight into attack position at 12,000 feet, rolled inverted to acquire the target, and initiated dive at approximately 55 degrees angle of attack. Airspeed built rapidly to 460 miles per hour indicated. At 7,000 feet, I observed what I initially thought was smoke from the locomotive stack. Then I saw a small red ball flash past my left wing. I suddenly realized it was tracer fire from a flak car positioned in the middle of the train. I had already committed to the attack and could not break off without exposing my element to defensive fire from other angles. I continued the dive, firing a burst from my .50 caliber guns at the locomotive, then shifted aim to the flak car. I observed strikes on both targets, released both 500-pound bombs at 4,000 feet, then pulled back firmly on the stick to initiate recovery. The flak sounded like hail on a tin roof as it hit my aircraft. I pulled up into the overcast layer for concealment and immediately checked for damage. My brake system was completely shot out. There was just a hole in my left wing where the pitot tube had been. Several control cables were partially severed. I could see daylight through holes in the fuselage behind my seat. The aircraft was still flying, but handling was degraded significantly. Moon nursed his damaged P-47 back to base, where ground crews counted 23 separate hits from 20mm cannon shells. The aircraft was repaired and returned to combat operations within 4 days, a testament to both the P-47's robust construction and the skill of American maintenance crews working in primitive field conditions. But Moon's experience became increasingly common throughout the summer and fall of 1944. German train-mounted Flak was catching P-47 pilots unprepared. The 9th Air Force lost 68 aircraft to train defenses in July alone, with 41 pilots killed, 19 captured, and 8 wounded but recovered. American tactical doctrine evolved rapidly in response. Fighter groups began attacking trains in coordinated elements rather than individual aircraft. The lead aircraft would suppress the flak cars with rocket fire or strafing runs, accepting high risk of damage or loss, while following aircraft attacked the locomotive with bombs during the brief window when gun crews were forced to take cover or reposition. The tactics were formalized in training documents distributed throughout the 9th Air Force in August 1944. The directives emphasized specific attack sequences designed to maximize effectiveness while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. First, the formation leader would identify the train and count the number of cars, looking specifically for flat cars that might carry flak guns. These were typically positioned second or third in the train, immediately behind the locomotive, and at intervals of 8 to 10 cars throughout the length of the train. Second, the flight would divide into attack elements. The first element, typically 2 aircraft, would make a high-speed diving pass on the flak cars from an unexpected angle, ideally with the sun behind them to complicate German optical tracking. They would fire their full ammunition load, approximately 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, in sustained bursts lasting 10 to 12 seconds. The goal was not necessarily to destroy the flak cars, though that was optimal, but to force gun crews to cease firing and take cover during the critical seconds when the bombing element attacked. Third, while the flak suppression element pulled off target, the bombing element, typically 4 aircraft, would roll into their attack dives from 15,000 to 20,000 feet altitude. They would follow identical dive angles, spacing their attacks by 3 to 4 seconds so that gun crews could not effectively engage multiple targets simultaneously. Fourth, the bombing element would release weapons at 4,000 to 5,000 feet altitude, typically 2 500-pound bombs per aircraft, configured with 4 to 5 second delay fuses. The delayed fuses allowed the bombs to penetrate cars or bury themselves in the ground before detonating, maximizing blast effect and preventing sympathetic detonation that could damage following aircraft. Fifth, all aircraft would execute their pullouts using maximum available G-force, typically 6 to 6.5 Gs, climbing back to altitude via different headings to complicate tracking by additional flak batteries positioned around the target area. The entire attack sequence, from initial identification to final aircraft pulling off target, would consume approximately 90 seconds. These coordinated attacks proved more effective than individual strikes, but they also revealed the extraordinary challenge of destroying locomotives under combat conditions. German locomotives, particularly the Kriegslokomotive class specifically designed for military operations, were remarkably resistant to damage. The typical German military locomotive weighed approximately 85 tons fully loaded. The boiler was constructed from steel plates up to 1.5 inches thick, capable of withstanding internal pressures exceeding 200 pounds per square inch. The firebox and running gear were built with combat damage in mind, featuring redundant systems and robust construction that could sustain significant hits without immediate failure. A 500-pound general-purpose bomb, the standard weapon carried by P-47 seconds on locomotive attacks, contained approximately 200 pounds of Torpex or Amatol high explosive. Detonation created a blast overpressure exceeding 100,000 pounds per square inch, within 10 feet of the explosion point, decreasing with distance according to inverse cube law. To destroy a locomotive reliably, the bomb needed to detonate within approximately 20 feet of the target. Farther than that, blast effect diminished rapidly, and the locomotive might sustain damage but remain operational. Closer than 10 feet, particularly direct hits on the boiler, would destroy the locomotive catastrophically, often triggering a secondary explosion as superheated steam vented violently. Achieving 20-foot accuracy from a 60-degree dive at 450 miles per hour while experiencing 6G pull-out forces, being shot at by automatic cannons firing 1,800 rounds per minute, required extraordinary skill and nerve. Many attacks missed by wider margins, damaging but not destroying the locomotive. German recovery and repair capabilities further complicated American efforts. Within hours of an attack, German railway repair crews would arrive with cutting torches, mobile cranes, and replacement locomotives. They would clear wreckage from the tracks, salvage undamaged rail cars, attach a new locomotive, and restore rail service. The entire process might take 12 to 24 hours for moderate damage. This forced American planners to shift tactics again. Instead of attacking individual trains, P-47 groups began targeting the rail network infrastructure itself: bridges, tunnels, marshalling yards, switching stations, maintenance facilities. Targets that, once destroyed, could not be quickly repaired, and whose destruction would paralyze entire sections of the rail network. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Bridge attacks presented unique challenges. A railroad bridge was a small, heavily defended, difficult target. Typical rail bridges were 30 to 50 feet wide and several hundred feet long, constructed from steel girders or reinforced concrete. They were inevitably defended by multiple flak batteries positioned to create overlapping fields of fire over the approach paths aircraft would use. But bridges were also critical choke points. A single destroyed bridge could cut rail service for days or weeks, forcing the Germans to route trains hundreds of miles out of their way or move supplies by truck at vastly reduced efficiency. One successfully destroyed bridge might eliminate more locomotive capacity than destroying 10 individual trains. The attack technique developed for bridges combined elements from dive bombing and a relatively new tactic called skip bombing, originally developed in the Pacific Theater against Japanese shipping. The concept was elegant. Instead of dropping bombs in a steep dive and relying on ballistic trajectory, pilots would approach the target at very low altitude and high speed, releasing bombs at precisely calculated moments so they would skip across the ground or water like flat stones, then impact the target at its most vulnerable point. For railroad bridges, the vulnerable point was typically the center span, where structural loads were highest and where damage would cause catastrophic collapse. A pilot would approach the bridge at 200 to 300 feet altitude, flying parallel to the river or valley the bridge crossed. At approximately 600 yards from the bridge, traveling at 350 to 400 miles per hour, he would release his bombs. The bombs, configured with 4-second delay fuses, would impact the ground at shallow angles, bounce, skip forward, maintaining much of their forward velocity, then strike the bridge structure and detonate. The delayed fuses allowed the bomb to penetrate into the bridge structure before exploding, maximizing damage to load-bearing members. The technique required exceptional timing and courage. The pilot had to fly straight and level through concentrated flak fire for 10 to 15 seconds, providing German gunners with an ideal target. Any evasive maneuvering would ruin aim and cause the bombs to miss. The pilot had to commit completely to the attack, accept the hits he would take, trust that the P-47's armor would keep him alive long enough to complete the mission. On August 15, 1944, the 365th Fighter Group executed one of the most determined bridge attacks of the campaign. Their target was a railroad bridge at Hasselt, Belgium, a critical link in the German supply route to forces attempting to contain the Allied breakout from Normandy. Previous attacks by medium bombers had failed to destroy the bridge despite dropping 68,000-pound bombs directly on the structure. First Lieutenant Neal Worley volunteered for a final low-altitude skip bombing attack. His after-action report, filed 3 days later from a hospital bed in England, describes what happened. "I made my first pass at the bridge from the south, flying at 250 feet above the river. Flak was extremely heavy, including 88s, 3.7s, and multiple 20mm positions. I could see tracers converging from at least 6 different gun positions. I released both bombs at 550 yards range and immediately took hits in my left wing and fuselage. The bombs impacted short of the bridge and skipped forward, striking the southern approach span. I observed one bomb detonate against the bridge support structure, but could not assess damage due to smoke and need to evade additional flak. I pulled up to 2,000 feet to set up a second pass and assess damage to my aircraft. Oil pressure was dropping and engine temperature rising, indicating cooling system damage. Multiple warning lights were illuminated. I decided to make a second attack pass before systems failed completely. On the second approach, I descended to 150 feet, attempting to stay below the tracking angle of the 88mm guns. Flak was even heavier than the first pass. A German troop train was stopped near the bridge with the locomotive crew and artillery soldiers firing small arms at me as I approached. I made a high-speed pass directly at the locomotive, intending to strafe it before attacking the bridge. I fired continuously, watching my tracers walk into the locomotive and then into the train behind it. I was so focused on the locomotive that I failed to observe a water tower supported by half-inch steel cables positioned immediately beyond the train. I flew directly through the cables at 380 miles per hour, approximately 40 feet of steel cable wrapped around my propeller. The impact was catastrophic. The propeller partially disintegrated. The cable began whipping against my canopy and fuselage with tremendous force. The entire aircraft vibrated violently. I lost all forward visibility due to oil covering the windscreen. I prepared to bail out, but found I was too low and traveling too fast for a safe parachute deployment. I saw a mound of earth ahead and instinctively pulled back on the stick. The aircraft went ballistic, clearing the earth mound and a concrete abutment beyond it, striking the ground approximately 100 yards past the obstacle at what I estimated to be 100 miles per hour. My head hit the gun sight hard enough to see stars. The aircraft skidded for several hundred feet, coming to rest inverted in a French farmer's field. I regained consciousness hanging upside down in my harness. I could smell fuel and feared fire. I released the harness and fell onto the canopy, which had shattered. I crawled out through the broken canopy and ran approximately 50 yards from the aircraft before collapsing. I heard someone shouting in English. An Englishman was running toward me, saying something about being in a spot of trouble. Allied forces arrived within minutes. I was evacuated to a field hospital, then to England for treatment of head injuries and multiple lacerations. Worley's P-47 was completely destroyed, the 20th aircraft lost by the 365th Fighter Group in bridge attacks during August 1944 alone. But remarkably, Worley survived with injuries that would fully heal within 6 weeks. He returned to combat operations in October, flew 37 additional missions, and survived the war. His survival exemplified the P-47's fundamental design philosophy. In any other fighter aircraft, flying through steel cables at 380 miles per hour, then crashing inverted at 100 miles per hour, would have killed the pilot instantly. The P-47's armoured cockpit, robust structure, and energy-absorbing design allowed Worley to walk away from a crash that should have been unsurvivable. This survivability translated into a measurable operational advantage. 9th Air Force statistics for July through September 1944 showed that P-47 pilots had an 82% survival rate when shot down over Allied-controlled territory and a 47% survival rate when shot down over enemy territory. Comparable statistics for P-51 Mustang pilots were 61% and 33% respectively. The higher survival rates meant experienced pilots remained in combat longer, accumulating knowledge that made them more effective. A pilot who survived being shot down once was significantly more cautious and skilled on subsequent missions. This created a reinforcing cycle where P-47 units became progressively more effective as pilots gained experience and shared lessons learned. By September 1944, 3 months after D-Day, the cumulative effect of the locomotive destruction campaign was becoming strategically visible. German commanders reported rail capacity in France had been reduced by 60 to 70% compared to pre-invasion levels. Entire divisions were immobilized for lack of fuel. Artillery units were rationing ammunition. Supply dumps near the front were nearly empty. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, told Allied interrogators after his capture that Allied air attacks had made it, quote, impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine, end quote. While this was hyperbole intended to excuse his military failures, it reflected genuine German recognition that Allied air superiority, particularly tactical fighter bombers, had crippled their ability to sustain ground operations. The statistics documented the campaign's effectiveness with brutal clarity. From D-Day on June 6, 1944, through the end of August, P-47 pilots claimed destruction or severe damage to 937 locomotives and 11,200 railcars in France alone. Photographic reconnaissance confirmed approximately 73% of these claims, a remarkably high verification rate compared to other target types. In specific high-intensity periods, the destruction rate was even more dramatic. During the week of August 7th through 13th, 1944, as German forces attempted to retreat from the Falaise Pocket encirclement, P-47 groups of XIX Tactical Air Command destroyed 86 locomotives in 7 days of continuous operations. This represented approximately 12 locomotives destroyed per day, achieved while simultaneously providing close air support to ground forces and flying combat air patrol missions. The 86 locomotives destroyed in 1 week became emblematic of the P-47's effectiveness in the ground attack role. No other aircraft achieved comparable destruction rates against such heavily defended targets. The Hawker Typhoon, flown by RAF squadrons in similar missions, achieved roughly 60% of the P-47's locomotive kill rate, despite being specifically designed as a ground attack aircraft. The P-51 Mustang, when used in ground attack roles, achieved only 40% of the P-47's effectiveness and suffered substantially higher loss rates. The difference was not pilot skill or courage. British, American, and even Free French pilots flying P-47 seconds all achieved similar results. The difference was the aircraft itself. The P-47 combined unique characteristics that made it ideal for attacking heavily defended point targets at low altitude. First, structural strength. The P-47's empty weight of 9,900 pounds was concentrated in thick aluminum airframe members designed to withstand 12G positive loads. This robust construction could sustain battle damage that would cause structural failure in lighter aircraft. Wings could lose entire sections and still provide adequate lift. Fuselages could be riddled with holes and still maintain structural integrity. Control surfaces could be partially destroyed, and the aircraft would remain controllable. Second, firepower. 8 50-caliber machine guns, while individually less powerful than the 20mm cannons carried by some other fighters, provided superior sustained fire capability. The 50-caliber guns were extraordinarily reliable, maintaining over 99% functionality even after hundreds of hours of combat operations. Gun jams were rare. When they occurred, the pilot still had 7 functioning guns. The convergence pattern, typically set for 300 yards, created a concentration of fire that could destroy locomotives, flak positions, or other hardened targets, with brief bursts. A 2-second burst delivered sufficient kinetic energy to penetrate locomotive boilers, destroy truck engines, rupture fuel tanks, or kill exposed personnel. Third, bomb carrying capacity. The P-47 could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, plus 10 high-velocity aircraft rockets, plus full ammunition for all 8 guns, plus external fuel tanks for extended range. This weapons load exceeded what many twin-engine medium bombers could carry, yet the P-47 could deliver it with far greater accuracy because the pilot could see the target clearly and adjust aim in real time. Fourth, survivability. The armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and radial engine configuration allowed the P-47 to absorb damage that would destroy other fighters. This enabled aggressive tactics. Pilots could press attacks to shorter ranges, remain over target areas longer, and make multiple attack passes on the same target, all of which increased hit probability and mission effectiveness. But the most critical advantage was psychological. P-47 pilots knew their aircraft could take hits and bring them home. This confidence enabled mission execution that would have been impossible in less survivable aircraft. When German Flak opened fire, P-47 pilots continued their attack runs. They aimed carefully despite being shot at. They released weapons at optimal release points instead of bombing prematurely to escape defensive fire. They pulled out of dives at minimum safe altitudes to maximize accuracy. This aggressive execution, enabled by confidence in the aircraft's survivability, translated directly into the superior kill ratios that made the P-47 the most effective ground attack aircraft in the European theatre. The culmination of the locomotive destruction campaign came during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive operation in the West, launched on December 16, 1944 through snow-filled forests of the Ardennes. Adolf Hitler had planned the Ardennes offensive specifically for winter, gambling that poor weather would ground Allied aircraft and negate the crushing air superiority that had paralyzed German operations since D-Day. His intelligence staff correctly assessed that without air support, Allied ground forces would be vulnerable to concentrated panzer attacks. The gamble initially succeeded. On December 16th, when German forces attacked through fog and snow, Allied aircraft were grounded. 28 German divisions, including 10 Panzer and Panzergrenadier divisions with over 1,000 tanks, smashed into thinly held American positions along an 80-mile front. The surprise was complete. American units were overrun, scattered, or surrounded. Within 48 hours, German forces had penetrated 15 miles into Allied lines, creating a bulge in the front that gave the battle its name. But Hitler's weather calculations failed to account for the temporary nature of winter storms. On December 23rd, the weather cleared, the sky opened, and 9,000 Allied aircraft, led by hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts, descended on the German columns with a fury that would break the offensive and effectively end Germany's ability to conduct large-scale military operations. The P-47 groups of IX and XIX tactical air commands launched from forward airfields in France and Belgium at first light. The targets were overwhelming in their abundance. German supply columns stretched for miles along narrow forest roads. Locomotives were running in daylight, desperately trying to move ammunition and fuel forward before Allied air attacks could interdict them. German panzer formations, which had been advancing rapidly under cloud cover, were now exposed in open terrain with nowhere to hide. Second Lieutenant Leslie Bowes of the 365th Fighter Squadron, 358th Fighter Group, remembered December 23rd as the most target-rich environment he had encountered in 6 months of combat. His testimony, recorded in 1946 by Army Air Forces historians, describes the systematic destruction of German logistics. We took off from our advance field at 06:15:36 P-47 seconds loaded with 2 500-pound bombs each and full ammunition. Weather was clear, temperature below freezing, visibility unlimited. We could see for 50 miles in every direction. As we climbed through 8,000 feet heading toward the front, we could already see smoke from burning vehicles on the roads below. When we reached the Bastogne area at 12,000 feet, the situation was immediately apparent. German columns were moving in broad daylight on every road leading toward the American positions. We could count hundreds of vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, tanks, artillery pieces, all moving forward in tight formations because the narrow roads and deep snow prevented dispersion. Our flight leader called targets and we went to work. We made our first diving attack on a column of approximately 40 trucks stopped at a crossroads northeast of Bastogne. 4 P-47 seconds attacked in sequence, dropping 8 bombs and strafing with all guns. The entire column was destroyed in approximately 90 seconds. Trucks were burning, ammunition was exploding, and we could see German soldiers running into the forest seeking cover. We climbed back to altitude and immediately identified another target. A locomotive pulling what appeared to be fuel cars was stopped at a siding approximately 3 miles east of our first attack. We attacked from 15,000 feet, diving at 60 degrees. I was third in the attack sequence. By the time I rolled in, the locomotive was already burning from hits by the first two aircraft. I released both bombs on the fuel cars behind the locomotive. The explosion was spectacular. I estimate 20 or more fuel cars detonated simultaneously, creating a fireball that rose over 1,000 feet. The blast was so powerful it buffeted my aircraft as I pulled out of my dive at 2,000 feet altitude. I glanced back and saw that the entire train had been consumed in flames. Black smoke was rising so high we could see it from 30 miles away on our return flight. We made 6 separate attacks that morning before returning to base with empty bomb racks and less than 100 rounds of ammunition remaining per gun. We destroyed 1 locomotive, approximately 60 trucks, 8 half-tracks, 2 tanks, and several unidentified vehicles. Every aircraft in our squadron returned safely, despite flying through moderate flak on at least 3 of the attacks. Bose's experience was replicated hundreds of times across the Ardennes battlefield during the week, between December 23rd and December 29th. 9th Air Force operations reports documented the systematic destruction of German mobility. On December 23rd alone, P-47 pilots claimed 73 locomotives destroyed or severely damaged, along with over 1,000 road vehicles. On December 26th, another 56 locomotives. On December 27th, 49 more. The cumulative effect was catastrophic for German operations. Panzer divisions that had been advancing 15 to 20 miles per day under cloud cover found themselves immobilized for lack of fuel. Artillery batteries that had been firing constantly in support of infantry attacks fell silent as ammunition supplies were consumed faster than they could be replenished. Medical units ran short of supplies to treat wounded soldiers. Food supplies dwindled, forcing German troops to subsist on reduced rations in sub-freezing weather. By December 29, 1944, the German offensive had culminated. Forward panzer spearheads, which had advanced to within 4 miles of the Meuse River and threatened to split Allied armies, were stopped by lack of fuel. They had achieved operational penetration, but could not exploit it because their logistics had been destroyed from the air. Over the following 2 weeks, as American and British ground forces counterattacked, the German forces that had created the bulge were systematically pushed back, suffering enormous losses in men and equipment they could not replace. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding German forces in the Ardennes, committed suicide on April 21, 1945, rather than face capture. In papers recovered after his death, he had written that the destruction of German rail capacity by Allied fighter bombers had been, quote, the decisive factor in the failure of the Ardennes offensive and the subsequent collapse of organized resistance in the West, end quote. German officers interviewed after the war universally cited Allied tactical air power, particularly P-47 operations against transportation infrastructure, as the most devastating aspect of the Western campaign. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich von Luttwitz, who commanded the 47th Panzer Corps during the Bulge, provided perhaps the most direct assessment in 1946. We could fight American infantry. We could fight American tanks. We had doctrine and tactics that worked. But we could not fight when our supplies never arrived because your aircraft destroyed every locomotive, every truck convoy, every bridge between us and our supply depots. A panzer division without fuel is just a collection of immobile steel boxes. Artillery without ammunition cannot fire. Infantry without food cannot fight. Your P-47 seconds did not defeat us in battle. They starved us until we could no longer resist. From D-Day through VE Day on May 8, 1945, P-47 pilots flying with the 8th, 9th, 12th, and 15th Air Forces claimed destruction of 9,015 locomotives and 86,400 railcars. Photo reconnaissance analysis, conducted after the war using comprehensive aerial photography archives, confirmed approximately 71% of locomotive claims and 68% of railcar claims. These confirmed totals, 6,400 locomotives and 58,700 railcars, represented the destruction of approximately 30% of Germany's entire pre-war rolling stock. The loss was irreplaceable. German locomotive production in 1944 despite massive efforts to increase output, totaled only 2,800 units. The P-47 were destroying locomotives more than twice as fast as German factories could replace them. The attacks forced dramatic changes in German railroad operations. By March 1945, German railways were operating at approximately 15% of their 1943 capacity. Trains could move only at night. Even nighttime operations were hazardous because Allied aircraft had developed night attack capabilities using external lights and flare illumination. Daylight movement of any kind was suicide. The disruption extended beyond immediate destruction of rolling stock. Railroad workers, whether German or pressed foreign labour, were deserting in massive numbers. The French railway workers' resistance, which had begun with subtle sabotage, evolved into open desertion after mid-1944, when it became clear that operating trains was fatal. German authorities were forced to use SS guards and threatened severe penalties, but even these measures could not maintain adequate staffing levels. Maintenance and repair became impossible. Railroad shops that would normally service locomotives and repair damaged equipment were themselves priority targets for Allied bombers. The mechanics and engineers who knew how to maintain the complex systems were either conscripted for military service or killed in Allied attacks on railroad facilities. The entire railway system was degrading not just through combat losses but through systemic collapse. By April 1945, as Allied armies advanced into Germany itself, they discovered the full extent of the devastation. Railroad marshalling yards were graveyards of destroyed and abandoned equipment. Locomotives sat rusting on sidings, damaged beyond repair, and lacking the spare parts or expertise to fix them. Burned-out rail cars were stacked in piles, pushed aside to clear tracks that had themselves been bombed so many times that maintenance crews had given up trying to repair them. The tactical triumph of the P-47 locomotive destruction campaign must be understood within the broader strategic context. The campaign succeeded not because of any single technological advantage or tactical innovation, but because it represented the intersection of multiple American strengths that Germany could not match. First, industrial capacity. The United States produced 15,683 P-47 during the war, more than any other American fighter except the P-51 Mustang. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, reached peak production of approximately 300 P-47 per month in mid-1944. When aircraft were lost in combat, replacements arrived within days. When pilots were lost, newly trained replacements were already en route from training schools in the United States. Germany could not match this replacement capacity. Locomotive production in 1944, despite enormous effort and priority allocation of resources, barely exceeded 2,800 units. Germany was losing locomotives faster than they could be built, creating an unsustainable downward spiral that could only end in complete transportation collapse. Second, pilot training. American replacement pilots arriving at P-47 groups in late 1944 had typically accumulated 200 to 250 hours of flight training, including 50 to 70 hours in the P-47 specifically. They arrived with solid understanding of aircraft, systems, weapons employment, and tactical doctrine. German replacement pilots in the same period often had less than 100 total flight hours and minimal time in their operational aircraft. This training advantage compounded over time. Experienced American pilots shared knowledge with new arrivals, creating institutional learning that improved tactics and mission effectiveness. German units, suffering catastrophic pilot losses and receiving poorly trained replacements, could not maintain this institutional knowledge. Their effectiveness degraded steadily throughout 1944 and early 1945. Third, logistics and maintenance. American maintenance crews, operating from forward airfields in primitive conditions, kept P-47 flying at operational readiness rates exceeding 80%. This meant that of every 100 P-47 assigned to a fighter group, typically 80 to 85 were available for combat operations on any given day. The remaining 15 to 20 were undergoing routine maintenance, battle damage repair, or engine changes. German Flak units, despite their sophistication and training, operated under progressively worsening supply conditions. Ammunition deliveries became sporadic. Replacement gun barrels, which wore out after firing several thousand rounds, were increasingly scarce. Optical rangefinders, mechanical fire control computers, and other precision equipment damaged in combat could not be repaired because parts and trained technicians were unavailable. Fourth, tactical flexibility. American fighter-bomber doctrine evolved continuously based on combat experience. Tactics that proved effective were immediately shared across all units, through standardized training documents and visiting instructors. Tactics that proved costly were modified or abandoned. The learning cycle from combat experience to doctrinal modification to training implementation typically took 2 to 3 weeks. German defensive doctrine had also evolved, but more slowly and with less effectiveness. The German military hierarchy, which emphasized rigid adherence to established doctrine, was less capable of rapid tactical innovation. By the time German Flak commanders developed effective countermeasures to American tactics had already evolved to counter the countermeasures. The cumulative effect of these advantages, industrial, training, logistical, and doctrinal, created an operational asymmetry that Germany could not overcome through skill, courage, or tactical brilliance. German flak gunners shot down hundreds of P-47 seconds. German locomotive engineers developed defensive tactics that complicated American attacks. German railway repair crews worked around the clock to restore damaged infrastructure. None of it mattered because the United States could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them, while Germany could not replace its losses at all. This represents perhaps the most important lesson of the P-47 locomotive destruction campaign. Tactical success in modern industrial warfare depends not primarily on the skill of individual warriors or the brilliance of tactical doctrine, but on the ability to sustain operations through superior logistics, training, and industrial production. The P-47 pilots who dove through flak to destroy locomotives were extraordinarily brave and skilled, but their bravery and skill would have been insufficient without the industrial system that provided them with aircraft, weapons, fuel, and training. The cost of this success deserves acknowledgement. Between D-Day and VE Day, the 9th Air Force alone lost 597 P-47 seconds to all causes in the ground attack role. Of these, approximately 420 were lost to anti-aircraft fire, with the remainder lost to operational accidents, mechanical failures, and weather. Of the pilots flying these aircraft, 287 were killed, 193 were captured, and 117 returned to Allied lines after being shot down. These numbers represent individual tragedies. Second Lieutenant William Nellis, for whom Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada would later be named, died on December 27, 1944, when his P-47 was hit by flak during an attack on a German column near Schumann's Eck, Luxembourg. He was on his 70th combat mission. First Lieutenant Raymond Knight, flying with the 350th Fighter Group in Italy, was killed on April 25, 1945, 2 weeks before the war ended, during a low-altitude strafing mission. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Each loss represented a family that received a telegram beginning with the words, quote, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret," end quote. Each loss was a mother who would never see her son again, a wife who would raise children alone, a father who had to bury his child instead of being buried by him as nature intended, but their sacrifice achieved its strategic purpose. By May 1945, Germany's transportation infrastructure was so thoroughly destroyed that organized military resistance became impossible. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, signed the unconditional surrender documents at Karlshorst, Berlin, on May 8, 1945, he acknowledged that Germany had lost the capacity to continue fighting. Among the factors he cited was the, quote, "complete destruction of our transportation network, which made it impossible to move reinforcements, supplies, or civilian refugees," end quote. The legacy of the P-47 locomotive destruction campaign extends far beyond World War II. The tactical lessons learned influenced close air support doctrine for decades. The recognition that interdiction of enemy logistics could be as decisive as direct engagement of enemy combat forces became a cornerstone of American air power theory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. During the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, Republic F-84 Thunderjets, spiritual successors to the P-47, flew interdiction missions against North Korean and Chinese rail networks using tactics directly derived from World War II P-47 operations. The results were similar. Communist forces, unable to sustain logistics under constant air attack, were forced into prolonged stalemate despite numerical superiority on the ground. In Vietnam, the interdiction campaign against the Ho Chi Minh Trail attempted to replicate the success of World War II railway interdiction, though with far less success due to the enemy's adaptation to dispersed logistics and nighttime movement. The failure in Vietnam led to important doctrinal insights about the limitations of air power against highly adaptive enemies with simple logistics requirements. During Desert Storm in 1991, coalition air forces systematically destroyed Iraqi transportation infrastructure in the weeks before ground operations commenced. The campaign drew explicitly on World War II lessons, using precision-guided munitions to achieve in days what P-47 seconds had required months to accomplish. When coalition ground forces attacked, they found Iraqi units immobilized and incapable of effective resistance, largely because their logistics had been destroyed from the air. The Fairchild Republic, a 10 Thunderbolt II, introduced in 1977 and named explicitly in honor of the P-47, carried forward the same design philosophy: survivability over performance, firepower over elegance, mission effectiveness over aesthetic appeal. The A-10's titanium armored cockpit, redundant flight control systems, and ability to absorb extraordinary battle damage are direct descendants of Alexander Kartvelyi's design principles. Modern fighter pilots studying close air support and interdiction operations still examine P-47 combat footage and after-action reports. The fundamental challenges remain unchanged. How do you attack point targets defended by sophisticated air defenses? How do you maximize accuracy while minimizing exposure time? How do you coordinate multiple aircraft against a single target? The answers developed by P-47 pilots in 1944 remain valid today, updated for modern weapons and sensors, but fundamentally unchanged in their core principles. The technical specifications that enabled the P-47's success deserve final recognition. The Pratt & Whitney R2 80059 double wasp engine, 18 cylinders displacing 2,804 cubic inches, producing 2,000 horsepower at rated power and 2,300 horsepower with water methanol injection, represented the peak of piston engine technology. No other air-cooled radial engine matched its combination of power, reliability, and battle damage tolerance. The turbocharger system, designed by General Electric, maintained sea-level engine performance up to 27,000 feet altitude. This gave the P-47 a critical advantage in both high-altitude escort missions and ground attack missions, where the ability to climb rapidly away from flak engagement zones saved countless lives. The armament of 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing with 425 rounds per gun, provided 3,400 rounds total, sufficient for approximately 30 seconds of sustained fire or 10 to 15 separate engagements using tactical burst firing. The 50 caliber round, firing armor-piercing incendiary ammunition at 2,800 feet per second, could penetrate locomotive boilers, destroy truck engines, rupture fuel tanks, and kill exposed personnel at ranges exceeding 500 yards. The bomb load capacity of 2,000 pounds carried on 1 centerline and 2 wing hardpoints, plus 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets gave the P-47 striking power equivalent to many medium bombers, while retaining single-seat fighter agility and speed. The ability to carry this weapons load, plus external fuel tanks extending range to over 460 miles, made the P-47 uniquely capable of both reaching distant targets and delivering decisive strikes when it arrived. But beyond the technical specifications lay something less quantifiable but equally important. The P-47 represented American industrial philosophy made tangible. It was big, heavy, powerful, and built to standards that emphasized reliability and survivability over minimum weight or maximum performance. It was the aircraft equivalent of a Sherman tank or a Liberty ship, functional, robust, and produced in overwhelming numbers that made individual losses acceptable because replacements were always available. German engineers who examined captured P-47 seconds recognized this philosophical difference immediately. Their reports noted that the P-47 used substantially more material than necessary for basic structural integrity. It accepted significant weight penalties for redundant systems. It sacrificed theoretical performance for practical survivability. One German technical analysis concluded with the observation that, quote, "The Americans have built a fighter optimized not for individual combat performance, but for industrial war," end quote. This industrial approach to warfare proved decisive. Germany built some of the most technically sophisticated aircraft of World War II. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter was faster than any Allied propeller aircraft. The Focke-Wulf Ta 152 high-altitude fighter had performance capabilities exceeding contemporary American fighters. But none of it mattered because Germany could not produce these sophisticated aircraft in sufficient numbers, could not train pilots adequately to fly them, and could not sustain them logistically in combat operations. The United States built 15,683 P-47 seconds, plus 50,000 other fighters, plus 18,000 heavy bombers, plus hundreds of thousands of other military aircraft. This industrial capacity, combined with training systems that produced over 400,000 military pilots during the war, created an asymmetry that skill and tactical brilliance could not overcome. The P-47 pilots who dove through Flak to destroy German locomotives understood this asymmetry instinctively. They knew they were part of something larger than individual combat. They were instruments of American industrial power, delivering violence to enemy logistics with a persistence and scale that no previous military force in history had achieved. When Second Lieutenant Milt Sanders executed his head-on strafing pass on a German locomotive, flew through its explosion, lost 5 to 10 feet of wingtip to debris, and still managed to nurse his damaged P-47 back to base, he was demonstrating more than personal skill or courage. He was demonstrating the operational superiority of an aircraft designed to sustain damage and complete its mission despite that damage. When Colonel Leo Moon attacked German supply trains, took 23 hits from train-mounted flak, and landed safely with holes throughout his aircraft that would have destroyed any other fighter, he was validating Alexander Kartvel's design philosophy that survivability enables aggressive tactics, and aggressive tactics win wars. When thousands of P-47 pilots, many barely 20 years old, dove repeatedly through walls of steel to drop bombs on defended targets, knowing that statistics said they would be shot down eventually, but that their aircraft gave them better survival odds than any alternative, they were executing a campaign that would help end the war and bring them home. The campaign succeeded not because American pilots were braver than their German opponents. German flak gunners demonstrated extraordinary courage, remaining at their guns under attack, firing until their positions were destroyed, dying in the defense of transportation infrastructure they knew was vital. The campaign succeeded because American industrial capacity could produce aircraft faster than combat could destroy them, could train pilots faster than combat could kill them, and could deliver weapons in quantities that simply overwhelmed German defensive capabilities. By April 1945, when P-47 pilots were flying interdiction missions over a collapsing Germany, they were not encountering the sophisticated, coordinated flak defenses that had made their missions so deadly in 1944. German flak units were out of ammunition, out of spare parts, out of trained crews. Many positions had been abandoned. The guns sat silent, useless, as American aircraft ranged unchallenged over German territory. This final phase air supremacy, achieved through attrition and industrial exhaustion of German defenses, represented the ultimate validation of American strategy. The United States had not needed to develop flak suppression weapons more sophisticated than German flak defenses. It had simply needed to continue operations until German defences collapsed from unsustainable losses. The story of P-47 pilots diving through flak to destroy locomotives is ultimately a story about industrial warfare in its most elemental form. It is a story about the collision between German technical sophistication and American industrial capacity. It is a story about young men in 7-ton fighters attacking defended targets with tactics that seem insane in retrospect, but were actually calculated applications of survivability advantages. Most importantly, it is a story about how wars are won not through brilliance or tactical innovation alone, but through the ability to sustain operations, absorb losses, learn from experience, and persist until the enemy can no longer continue. The P-47 pilots, who had destroyed 9,000 locomotives and 86,000 rail cars between D-Day and VE Day, did not win through superior skill, though many were exceptionally skilled. They did not win through better tactics, though American tactical doctrine was effective. They won because they were flying aircraft designed to survive, supported by industrial systems that could replace losses, executing missions that systematically destroyed enemy logistics until organized resistance became impossible. That is why P-47 crews started diving through flak. That is how they destroyed 86 locomotives in 1 week during the peak of operations. And that is why the campaign succeeded despite costing nearly 600 aircraft and almost 600 pilots. The mathematics of industrial warfare are brutal and simple. The side that can sustain losses while inflicting irreplaceable losses on the enemy will win. The P-47 locomotive destruction campaign exemplified this principle in its purest form. The German aces who survived the war, men like Heinz Baer and Gerhard Barkhorn, men who had shot down hundreds of Allied aircraft, consistently identified the P-47 as the opponent they respected most, not because it was the fastest, not because it was the most maneuverable, but because it represented something they could not defeat. It represented American industrial might, made tangible, made deadly, made unstoppable. The lesson remains valid today. In modern conflict, technical sophistication matters less than the ability to sustain operations. Individual warrior skill matters less than systemic capacity to train, equip, and deploy forces continuously. Tactical brilliance matters less than industrial capacity to produce weapons, ammunition, and equipment in quantities that overwhelm enemy defenses through sheer persistence. The P-47 Thunderbolt diving through flak to destroy German locomotives was not the most elegant solution to the problem of interdicting enemy logistics. It was simply the most effective solution that American industrial capacity could deliver and sustain. And in war, effectiveness trumps elegance every time. The young men who flew those missions, who dove straight down through walls of steel at 500 miles per hour, who released bombs at 4,000 feet while experiencing 6G pullouts and being shot at by automatic cannons, who did this repeatedly, knowing the statistics said they would eventually be shot down, those young men deserve to be remembered not just for their courage, but for what their courage achieved. They destroyed the logistics that sustained German armies. They made it impossible for Germany to continue organized resistance. They helped end a war that had killed tens of millions and threatened to destroy civilization itself. They did this flying a 7-ton fighter that was too heavy, too big, and according to early critics, completely wrong for the mission. They proved the critics wrong through 9,000 destroyed locomotives and final victory. That is the story of why P-47 crews started diving through flak. That is how they achieved destruction rates of 86 locomotives in 1 week. And that is why the tactical triumph of the P-47 locomotive destruction campaign represents one of the decisive factors in Allied victory in Europe, not through brilliance, not through innovation, through relentless, persistent, systematic application of overwhelming industrial capacity, translated into tactical effect by young men who trusted their aircraft to bring them home. And often enough, it did. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.